A millionaire saw his maid teaching his son to dance, but he didn't know she hid a past that could change everything. Now, a truth buried for years will surface, risking everything he thought he controlled. Thomas Walker's mansion was more than just a home. It was a reflection of his character, his discipline, his unshakable belief that order was the foundation of any success. Everything in that house functioned like a well-oiled machine, leaving no room for mistakes, improvisations, or distractions. The immaculate hallways exuded a subtle scent of polished wood and lavender. The black marble of the entryway gleamed under strategically placed lights. Each piece of furniture, each decoration, every painting on the walls had been chosen not just for its value, but for the aesthetic harmony it brought to the space. Nothing was out of place. The windows, always spotless, offered a stunning view of the perfectly manicured garden, where each plant grew within a meticulously planned pattern. Thomas's routine was as calculated as the operations of his house. He woke at 5:30 a.m., drank a strong black coffee, and reviewed the daily reports before heading to the office. On the way, he made two strategic calls, one to the financial director and another to his legal advisor. Lunch meant a business meeting. At the end of the workday, he reviewed contracts and gave his team clear, direct orders. Time for distractions? Non-existent. Not even inside his home did he relax. His staff was trained for maximum efficiency. The housekeeper, security guards, cleaning crew, chauffeur, and even the cook. Each knew exactly what to do and when. Thomas tolerated no mistakes. Predictability was his greatest ally. So when he returned home earlier than usual that evening and crossed the long glass corridor of the mansion, he expected to find nothing but the usual tranquility. But something made him stop abruptly. In the garden, Michael was dancing. The shock first came as a subtle hesitation, a slight delay in Thomas's steps, his gaze fixed on the scene beyond the glass. His son, Michael, only 12 years old, moved with energy and lightness across the neatly trimmed grass. But he wasn't alone. By his side, moving with an unexpected fluidity, was Emily, the cook. Thomas blinked, unable to fully process what he was seeing. His eyes traced every detail of the scene. Michael smiled, not a contained or polite smile, but a genuine expression of joy, a happiness Thomas hadn't seen in a long time. Since the death of Charlotte, his wife, the light in the boy's eyes had faded, but now, there it was again, shining brightly. Then came the discomfort. The kitchen was Emily's domain. That was where Thomas was used to seeing her, always discreet, always efficient, managing meals with the competence expected of a Walker Mansion employee. But here, in the garden, she was someone else. Her movements were not those of a cook, simply improvising a dance to entertain a child. There was something more: precision, technique, grace. Emily moved with a mastery that went beyond improvisation. Her body responded to the music naturally, her gestures were assured, her posture impeccable. This wasn't play, it was knowledge. Thomas felt a chill in his chest. It was hard to say what disturbed him more: the fact that Michael was dancing, or the fact that this woman, whom he considered nothing more than a functional part of his household, was influencing his son in a way that he himself couldn't. The reality hit him like a blow. There was something slipping out of his control. Thomas didn't like surprises, and this one especially disturbed him in a way he couldn't explain. Without hesitation, he turned the doorknob and walked toward the garden. The discomfort grew inside Thomas like a shadow. His chest was heavy, his jaw clenched, and every fiber of his body rejected the scene before him. Michael, his son, dancing in the garden, and beside him, Emily, the cook, moving with a skill that should not belong to someone of her station. Without realizing it, he clenched his fists. Then he took the first step. His leather shoes met the stone path leading to the lawn, and the restrained force in his step reverberated in the quiet surroundings. The sound was enough to break the bubble of tranquility that enveloped Michael. The boy turned, and his entire body seemed to shrink at the sight of his father approaching. The joy vanished from his face. Michael's brown eyes, which moments before had been sparkling with enthusiasm, now widened in a mix of surprise and fear. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if the air had suddenly grown heavier. Emily, on the other hand, remained still. She didn't turn immediately, nor did she trip over her own steps to justify herself. She simply stood there, upright, her posture somehow defying the weight of Thomas's gaze. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was calm, but her eyes held an almost defiant firmness. Thomas stopped a few steps away from them. His gaze was sharp, like a blade. "What is going on here?" His voice came out controlled, low, but full of authority. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Michael lowered his head, avoiding his father's gaze, nervously fiddling with the hem of his t-shirt. Thomas noticed the hesitant way the boy acted, how he seemed smaller than he really was, as if he wanted to disappear. Before the boy could attempt to answer, Emily did. "We were rehearsing, Mr. Thomas. Simple, direct, without preamble." And yet, that answer had the effect of a lit match in a room full of gas. Thomas's stomach turned, and his irritation grew. The ease with which Emily spoke, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, only made his suspicion grow stronger. "Rehearsing?" he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word in his mouth. Emily held his gaze. Michael, for his part, shrank even further. His heart hammered in his chest, and he knew he had to speak before his father made his own conclusions. The boy hesitated. "I wanted to learn how to dance." Thomas turned his eyes from Emily to his son. "And when did this happen?" Michael hesitated for a moment, as if gathering courage to continue. "For a while now, but I didn't have anyone to practice with." The confession landed in the air like an invisible weight. Thomas realized he hadn't known about this. He had no idea his son had any interest in dancing. He, who always thought he knew every detail of the boy's routine, was now confronted with a truth that had completely eluded him. Emily remained silent. She watched the exchange between father and son, but without intervening. Her role in this conversation was clear: no apologies. Thomas breathed deeply. Something about this interaction unsettled him in a way he couldn't define. Why had Michael been hiding this from him? And more importantly, who exactly was Emily to know something about his son before he did? His eyes returned to her, studying her more closely. Since hiring her, he had never bothered to learn much about her life. She was efficient in the kitchen, discreet, did her job flawlessly. But now, seeing her here, noticing the ease with which she moved and the calm with which she met his presence, something told him she wasn't just a cook. There was more, and he needed to find out what it was. "Come with me." His voice cut through the silence with a definitive tone. Emily didn't hesitate. She simply nodded and followed Thomas back into the house, while Michael remained in the garden, his chest tight and the feeling that this would not end well growing inside him. If you're still watching this, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The conversation with Emily still echoed in Thomas's mind as he walked down the silent corridors of the mansion. Each step reverberated off the cold marble, mirroring the growing unease inside him. Michael was already in his room, and the house had fallen into the usual quiet of the night, but for Thomas, nothing felt normal. He entered the office and closed the door behind him, the click of the lock sounding louder than expected in the empty room. The space was a reflection of his personality, organized, austere, immaculate. Shelves filled with technical and legal books lined the walls, and the mahogany desk, positioned strategically in the center of the room, displayed only a closed laptop, a notebook, and a half-full glass of whiskey. Sitting in the leather chair, Thomas powered up the computer. The glow of the screen illuminated his face as he exhaled slowly, trying to organize his thoughts. Emily Garcia. Who was she really? Since she was hired, he had never questioned her past. All he needed was someone efficient to manage the kitchen, and she did her job without fail. Discreet, precise, invisible when needed. But that afternoon in the garden had changed everything. There was something in the way Emily moved, a natural elegance, a precision in her gestures that didn't belong to an ordinary cook. Michael seemed to trust her in a way Thomas didn't understand, and that bothered him. With a swift motion, he typed her name into the search bar. The initial results brought up superficial information, similar names, irrelevant profiles. Thomas narrowed his eyes, refining the search. He added keywords: dance, ballet, career. Then, something appeared. The title of the article made his breath catch. Ballet prodigy disappears from the stage without explanation. Thomas clicked on the link, and the page loaded quickly. His eyes skimmed the text eagerly, each line reinforcing the sense that he was about to uncover something much bigger than he had imagined. The article was old, published 7 years ago. It detailed the promising career of a ballerina who had emerged as one of the greatest talents in classical dance in Mexico. Her name, Emily Garcia. His heart raced. The report mentioned her meteoric rise. Emily was considered a rare phenomenon, a ballerina whose impeccable technique and unusual expressiveness captivated both audiences and critics. Still young, she had secured a contract for an international tour, something few artists her age had achieved. But at the peak of her career, she disappeared. She simply left the stage. No goodbyes, no scandals, no explanations. From one day to the next, Emily Garcia ceased to exist in the world of dance. Thomas scrolled down the page, and then he saw the attached photo and froze. In the image, a much younger Emily stared directly into the camera. The face was the same, but there was something different about her. Dressed in a classic ballet costume, balanced in a perfect ballet pose, her body exuded confidence and lightness, but it was her eyes that stood out the most. They held an intense flame, an unwavering certainty. Nothing in that photo reminded him of the woman who worked in his kitchen. Thomas leaned back in the chair, running a hand over his chin. This didn't make sense. Why would someone with such a brilliant future throw it all away? And more importantly, why would she hide that past? He went back to the article. The piece speculated on some possible reasons for her disappearance. An accident, health problems, disagreements with directors. But none of the theories seemed confirmed. The only certainty was that after her disappearance, no one had heard from her again, until now. Closing the laptop, Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. Something wasn't right. Emily wasn't just a talented cook, she was a former ballet prodigy who, for some reason, had chosen to erase her past. And now here she was, in his house, teaching his son to dance. The thought unsettled him deeply. He didn't like mysteries within his own home, and Emily had just become one. He needed answers. The silence in the house seemed even heavier as Thomas descended the stairs. The kitchen lights were on, casting soft shadows on the impeccably arranged furniture. The subtle scent of freshly brewed coffee still lingered in the air, mixed with the sweet aroma of something that had likely been prepared earlier. He found Emily by the counter, finishing drying a dish. The sound of the cloth against the porcelain was the only noise in the room. When she noticed his presence, she didn't flinch. She simply placed the dish on the sink and turned to face him. Thomas's eyes were cold and calculating as he moved forward without hesitation, placing his phone on the marble counter. The screen glowed with the headline of the article. Ballet prodigy disappears from the stage without explanation. The impact was immediate. Emily froze for a moment, her expression quickly shifting from surprise to something more controlled. Her eyes scanned the screen, stopping on the photo. The youthful, confident face staring back at her from the image seemed to belong to another life. She took a deep breath, as if she needed to prepare herself. Then, without taking her gaze off the article, she murmured, "I wonder how long it would take for you to find out." The response intrigued Thomas. "So, you weren't planning on hiding it forever?" Emily let out a faint sigh. She picked up the phone carefully, scrolling through the screen, her eyes skimming the words that told her own story. Her face remained impassive, but her fingers trembled slightly. "It wasn't a secret. It just wasn't something I wanted to revisit." Thomas crossed his arms. His patience was running thin. "Why did you give it all up?" Emily slowly lifted her gaze to him. Her eyes were darker now, heavy with something Thomas couldn't immediately decipher. "Because dance killed me," she said without hesitation. He furrowed his brow, waiting for her to elaborate. "Who?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Arturo." The name left her lips as a whisper, laden with memories. She turned her gaze toward the window, as though seeing something beyond the dark night. "Arturo was my fiancé and my dance partner. We trained together for years. He always said our moment would come, that we would shine together on stage. The last time we spoke, he was excited, laughing. He said that the next day we would be immortal." A pause, a tightness in her lips, but he didn't show up for the final rehearsal or for the performance. The silence between them became suffocating. "What happened?" Thomas asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Emily clenched her hands around the dish towel, her knuckles turning white. "An accident. A damned accident. He went out to get something from the city and never came back. A car, a drunk driver. It all happened in seconds." Thomas didn't respond. He simply observed the way Emily's shoulders seemed to slump, as though a part of her still carried the weight of that day. "When I got the news, something inside of me died with him." The confession came raw, without embellishment. Emily ran her tongue over her dry lips before continuing. "I tried to dance the next day. I tried to go on stage, but my legs wouldn't obey me. Dance, which had once been everything to me, became an unbearable weight. Every movement reminded me of him. Every note of the music seemed to mock his absence." Thomas breathed in slowly. He wasn't a man moved by sentimentality, but in that moment he saw Emily not as the cook in his house, but as a woman who had lost everything. "So you gave it all up," he said. "Yes, I left. I left the stage, the contracts, the applause. I went to the only place where no one would recognize me." She raised her gaze again, and something in her expression challenged Thomas to judge her. "And now, here I am." The silence lingered for a few moments. Thomas processed everything, the pieces finally falling into place. But at the same time, new questions emerged. What would have happened if Arturo hadn't died? Would she still be shining on the stage? And more importantly, why, years later, was she dancing again? Dinner went as it always did, wrapped in the meticulous silence that dominated the Walker household. The clinking of cutlery against plates was the only sound filling the space, aside from the occasional crackling of the fire in the background. Thomas sliced his meat with precision, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Michael fidgeted with his food, hesitant. Emily served the table in silence. Since their conversation in the kitchen, there had been a subtle tension between her and Thomas. He now knew who she really was, but he was still processing this information, trying to understand what it meant for his house, his son, and his perfectly ordered life. It was Michael who broke the bubble of silence. "Dad," His voice was hesitant but determined. Thomas slowly raised his eyes, setting his cutlery down, his gaze fixed on his son, evaluating him. "Yes?" The boy swallowed hard. He felt an odd chill in his stomach, but if he didn't speak now, he would never have the courage to do so. "I want to compete." The silence was immediate. Emily, who was holding a jug to refill Michael's glass, froze mid-motion. Thomas remained motionless, his eyes locked on the boy as if trying to confirm if he had heard correctly. "Compete," he repeated slowly. Michael nodded, his hands starting to sweat. "Yes, in the dance tournament. I want to sign up." Thomas blinked once, then again. It was as if the information took longer to process. His son wanted to compete in a dance tournament. The idea was so absurd that he had to force himself to maintain a neutral expression. "Are you serious, Michael?" The boy nodded again, this time with more conviction. "Yes, I've been practicing. Emily thinks I'm ready." When he heard her name, Thomas narrowed his eyes. There it was. Emily. She wasn't just teaching Michael to dance. Now she was encouraging him to compete. The word tournament reverberated in Thomas's mind with a weight he hadn't expected. "How long have you been practicing?" "A few weeks." "And you didn't tell me anything?" Michael hesitated before responding. "I wanted to make sure first before I said anything." Thomas breathed slowly, his fingers grazing the edge of his plate. His son had been hiding things from him. Not just a passing hobby, but a real desire. Something that mattered enough for him to face that rigid gaze Thomas always used to shut down conversations before they even started. Emily, until then silent, watched everything attentively. Her eyes shifted from Michael to Thomas, as if waiting for the outcome of this moment. Thomas looked away from his son and fixed his gaze on her. "Do you think he's ready?" Emily didn't retreat. "I think he has talent and dedication." Her response was straightforward, without hesitation. Thomas leaned back in his chair. He felt challenged in a way he couldn't explain. He didn't like losing control of things inside his own house, and now he realized that Michael and Emily were creating a world he didn't have access to. And that bothered him deeply. He could say no. He could end the conversation with a single word and prevent Michael from nurturing illusions about something so far from the meticulous reality Thomas had planned for him. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the spark in his son's eyes, a spark he hadn't seen in years. Maybe it was the fact that Michael was, for the first time, fighting for something. Thomas exhaled deeply and then spoke with the same firmness as always. "If you're going to do this, you'll have to take it seriously." Michael's eyes widened. "You mean I can?" "I mean that if you start, there will be no quitting, no excuses, you'll go all the way." Michael's chest swelled with joy. A smile slipped out before he could control it. "I promise." It was a different smile, one that Thomas hadn't seen in a long time. He didn't respond. He simply picked up his glass of wine and took a sip, feeling that somehow something much bigger than a simple competition had begun that night. The next morning, the Walker mansion felt different. There was a new energy in the air, a vibration that hadn't been there before. Michael's announcement the previous night still echoed in Thomas's mind, and though he wouldn't admit it, he was intrigued. Did his son really want this? And more than that, was he capable of seeing it through? He descended the stairs and found Michael and Emily already positioned in the training room. The space, once used for private events, had now been transformed into an improvised studio. The huge windows let natural light flood the room, reflecting off the polished floor. A large mirror covered part of one wall, and in the center of the room, Michael stood, nervous, while Emily adjusted the music on her phone. As soon as the melody began, the training commenced. Emily was no longer the same woman who cooked in the mansion. As a trainer, her demeanor was different. Her voice was firm, her instructions direct. Every mistake Michael made was corrected immediately. Every poorly executed step was redone until it reached perfection. "One more time," her voice echoed through the room. Michael was panting but didn't complain. He repeated the movement, focused. Thomas watched from a distance, arms crossed. He had never seen his son like this, so focused, so determined. It wasn't like the sports classes he forced Michael to take, where the boy simply did the bare minimum. Here, there was a different spark in the boy's eyes. The training continued for hours. Emily demonstrated the steps with mastery, her movements so natural that even Thomas, who had never shown any interest in dance, recognized her skill. She demanded, corrected, made Michael repeat until it was right. And he obeyed, absorbing every detail, pushing himself until he got it right. When the training ended, Michael was sweating and exhausted, but there was a small, discreet smile on his face. "It's better," Emily said, handing him a water bottle. "But there's still a lot of work to do." Thomas realized that, for the first time, Michael seemed to enjoy the challenge. That evening, as Michael rested, a notification popped up on the boy's phone, catching his attention. He furrowed his brow as he saw the name on the screen, Daniel Scott. Thomas didn't know much about the world of dance, but from the tone of the message, he didn't need to understand much to know what was going on. "I hope you enjoy the tournament, rookie, but don't think you have a chance." Michael, who had just read the message, fell silent, biting his lower lip. Thomas noticed the tension on his son's face. "Who is Daniel Scott?" he asked, taking the phone from Michael's hand. Michael hesitated before answering. "He won the tournament the last 2 years. Everyone says he's the best competitor." Thomas examined the message again. Then, for the first time, he gave his son a piece of advice that was different from what he usually said. "If he's trying to bring you down before the competition even starts, it's because he already sees you as a threat." Michael looked up. Those words seemed to carry special weight. "Do you think so?" Thomas handed the phone back to him. "I'm sure of it." For the first time in years, Michael felt that he had something to fight for. The day of the tournament had arrived. From the moment he woke up, Michael felt a different kind of excitement in his chest. Anticipation consumed him from the inside out, alternating between electric exhilaration and paralyzing fear. He tried to act normal, but his movements were more restrained, his responses shorter. Even during breakfast, which was usually one of the quietest moments of the day, he only nibbled at his toast, staring at the glass of orange juice without actually drinking it. Emily noticed. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Michael raised his eyes, hesitating for a moment before responding. "I think so." Emily gave a slight smile, never taking her eyes off him. "I think isn't enough. Either you're ready or you're not." He took a deep breath. He wanted to say yes, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't allow it. It was Thomas who intervened, setting his coffee cup down on the saucer with a soft clink. "You've trained. If you trained, you're ready. If you didn't train enough, that's your fault." Michael frowned, unsure if those words were meant to encourage him or just add more pressure. "Thomas," Emily started, but stopped herself. She knew that tone. She knew that Thomas was not the type of man to soften his words or offer emotional support the way she would. But maybe, for Michael, hearing that was better than any comforting words. In the car, the silence was thick. The mansion was far behind as they drove to the theater. Michael stared out the window, watching the city speed by, its rhythm so different from the chaos inside him. The sound of the tires against the pavement seemed to echo in his head, and the closer they got to the venue, the harder his heart beat. When they arrived, the hustle and bustle backstage enveloped them like a storm. The theater was massive, and the organized chaos of the tournament was palpable in every corner. Dancers of all ages were warming up, spinning, stretching, mentally rehearsing the routines they were about to perform. Organizers rushed about, holding clipboards and checking schedules. The air smelled of makeup and the faint scent of sweat, creating an atmosphere thick with energy and tension. Michael felt his palms begin to sweat. He observed a group of competitors conversing in the corner, all dressed in immaculate costumes. Their movements were precise, even in their stretching. The fear of not measuring up surged within him again, tightening his breath. That's when he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. Emily was there. "Breathe," she said, her tone calm but commanding. Michael looked at her, feeling small in the face of the calm she exuded. "You've done the work. Now just dance." It was a simple phrase, but there was something in it that made sense. He had trained, made mistakes, corrected them. He had spent weeks perfecting every detail, every movement. There was nothing more he could do now but trust in himself. Emily squeezed his shoulder lightly and stepped back, giving him space. Michael turned to the other side where Thomas stood. His father's arms were crossed, observing everything with his usual unreadable expression. But when Michael met his gaze, Thomas made a small gesture with his head. "Go." Not another word, but that single command was enough. His name was called. The backstage area seemed to dissolve as he walked toward the stage. The world around him faded. The buzz of other competitors and organizers became a muffled sound in the back of his mind. The air felt heavier, each step more difficult. He stood there behind the curtain as the seconds dragged on. Then, the lights in the theater adjusted. The curtain rose, and the music began. The first note vibrated through the air. Michael closed his eyes for a moment and felt each note travel through his body. When he opened them, there was no more doubt, no more fear or hesitation, just the dance. His movements flowed, first gentle, then gaining strength and precision. Every turn, every jump, every stretch of his arms seemed to tell a story. He wasn't just executing the steps Emily had taught him, he was conveying what he felt. The audience disappeared. He danced as if no one were watching, as if only the music existed. Then came the most critical moment of the choreography, the jump, the most difficult move, the riskiest. His breathing became controlled. He knew what needed to be done. His muscles prepared, and then he propelled himself. His body soared, reaching the highest point of the jump. For that brief moment in the air, everything around him seemed to dissolve. It was a moment frozen in time. Then he landed. Perfect. The theater was silent for a millisecond, and then the sound of applause exploded through the hall. The sound of applause filled the theater like a rising wave, echoing through every corner of the grand hall. Michael remained in the center of the stage, his chest rising and falling rapidly, trying to catch his breath. He had done it. He had made it. Every second of training, every mistake corrected, every drop of sweat shed, had culminated in that moment. From the audience, Emily kept her eyes fixed on him, a small, proud smile lighting up her face. Thomas, sitting next to her, remained still, watching his son with an unreadable expression. For the first time, he no longer saw Michael as a fragile boy, someone who needed to be molded to fit into a predetermined world. For the first time, he saw his son as he truly was, and that struck him in a way he hadn't expected. The commotion in the theater continued as the judges deliberated. Michael returned backstage, his heart still racing. Other competitors looked at him with various expressions, some curious, some impressed. Others seemed bothered. He didn't know how to interpret it all. All he knew was that he had given everything. Minutes later, the dancers were called back to the stage. The time for the award ceremony had arrived. The master of ceremonies held a golden envelope and, with a formal smile, announced the result of the competition. And the winner of this year's tournament for the third consecutive year is Daniel Scott. The theater erupted in applause once again. Daniel, who had been standing a few meters from Michael, confidently walked forward to receive his trophy. His face wore an obvious expression of satisfaction. He raised the award with ease, as though he had been expecting it all along. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't won, but before that feeling could consume him, the voice of the Master of Ceremonies echoed once more. However, this year, we would like to recognize a performance that touched both the audience and the judges in a special way. The Artistic Expression Award goes to Michael Walker. For a second, Michael didn't process it. He blinked, confused, and only realized he had to move when Emily, backstage, gave him a gentle push toward the stage. He walked to the center of the stage, and the theater erupted into applause once again. This time, the sound felt different. He hadn't won first place, but he had earned something. When he received the medal, he felt its weight against his chest and understood. It was more than just an award. It was proof that he belonged in this world. As he stepped down from the stage, Michael was lost in his own thoughts. That's when he realized Daniel Scott was approaching him. The two-time champion stopped in front of him, sizing him up for a moment, as if deciding whether it was worth saying something. "You might actually be decent next year," he said, without any mockery, just a dry acknowledgement, and then he walked away, as if that brief comment was enough. Michael stood there, processing the words. He knew that Daniel Scott wasn't the type to hand out compliments. The mere fact that he had said that meant something. When he left the stage and found Thomas and Emily in the theater lobby, Michael's face was lit up in a way Thomas hadn't seen in a long time. Without saying a word, Thomas placed his hand on his son's shoulder and asked, "How do you feel?" Michael looked up at him. His smile hadn't faded. Proud. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he remembered the quiet boy Michael used to be. The nights when he would find him alone, staring into nothing, and now, standing before him, was a different boy. A boy who had found something that made him shine. It was a new feeling for Thomas, and strangely, a good one. Michael took a deep breath before asking, "Can I keep training?" Emily remained still as she heard that. Thomas didn't respond immediately. His gaze wandered over his son's face, studying every detail. Then, a small, genuine smile appeared on his lips. "Of course. We're just getting started." The spark in Michael's eyes grew brighter. He didn't want to just dance. He wanted to get better. And for the first time, Thomas was willing to support him. The car glided silently through the streets of Mexico City, cutting through the yellow glow of the streetlights that lit the night. The buzz of the tournament was already far behind, and now only the quiet hum of the engine filled the space between them. In the back seat, Michael held the medal firmly in his hands, his fingers slowly running over its metallic surface. First place hadn't been his, but somehow that didn't seem to matter as much as he thought it would. He raised his eyes and saw his reflection in the window. He no longer saw himself as the insecure boy who had hesitated to tell his father he wanted to dance. That Michael, the one who kept his dreams hidden to avoid disappointing others, was no longer there. In the driver's seat, Thomas kept his eyes on the road, his expression closed but distant. Emily, sitting next to him, stared out the window as though lost in her own thoughts. Michael tightened his grip on the medal once more before slipping it into his pocket. When they arrived at the mansion, the house greeted them with the same imposing silence as always. Thomas climbed the stairs without saying a word, disappearing into his office. Emily removed her shoes as she entered the kitchen, relaxing her shoulders as if she were finally allowing the tension of the day to escape. Michael hesitated for a moment before following her. She was already preparing tea when he entered. She turned to him as she noticed his presence, raising an eyebrow slightly. You should be sleeping." He smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "I just wanted to thank you." Emily tilted her head, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. For what? For everything. For the time, the patience, for believing in me. She studied him for a moment before smiling and returning to her work. "You did all the work, Michael. I just showed you the way." Michael reflected on that. Before he met her, dance had been just a secret desire, something that seemed out of his reach. But Emily had made that dream real. He nodded, not needing to say anything else. "Good night, Emily." "Good night, Michael." He left the kitchen, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Upstairs, Thomas poured himself some whiskey and walked to the large window in his office. The city spread out before him, a mosaic of lights twinkling in the distance. His son had changed. And in some way he had too. For years, Thomas had believed that success meant control, rigid discipline, following a predetermined path with no deviations. He had always lived his life that way. But Michael, with his dance, with his unexpected passion, was proving that there were other paths. And Thomas was beginning to wonder if his inflexible vision of what it meant to succeed had, in fact, been incomplete. He took a sip of the whiskey, feeling the liquid burn in his throat, and continued staring out at the city. The days that followed brought a new routine to the Walker household. Michael kept training with Emily, now with renewed enthusiasm. But there was something different. Thomas was no longer just a distant observer. He started asking questions. At first, they were just occasional comments while he watched the training. "Why is this movement done this way? What's the difference between this technique and that one? How long does it take to master this move?" Emily answered with patience, and Michael grew excited seeing his father's interest, even though it was subtle. As the days passed, Thomas began to see dance not just as a hobby of his son's, but as an art that required discipline, strength, and strategy, everything he valued in any other field. It was subtle, but Michael noticed. His father didn't openly say he supported his decision to continue dancing, but he showed it in other ways. And then came dinner. It was an ordinary night. The table was set with the usual precision, and the conversation flowed calmly between Michael and Emily. Thomas listened more than he spoke, until at one point he set down his cutlery and looked directly at Emily. "Have you ever thought about teaching professionally?" The silence settled over the table. Emily blinked, clearly surprised by the question. She didn't answer right away. She picked up the napkin between her fingers, twirling it slightly, a gesture almost unconscious. "I'm not sure if I'm ready for that," she said finally. Thomas kept his gaze on her, studying her response. "Ready to teach or ready to return to the world of dance?" Emily felt a pang in her chest. She'd never thought about it that way. She had always thought that by stepping away from the stage, she had left that part of her life behind. But Michael had brought dance back into her life in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't know," she answered honestly. And for the first time, Thomas realized that Emily, just like Michael, was on her own journey. Emily twirled the teacup between her fingers, sitting at the kitchen table, as Michael excitedly talked about the ballet performance happening that evening. "You're going to love it, Emily. It's going to be incredible. The company's director said this show is one of the best of the year." She only smiled, not responding immediately. Since Michael had started talking about the idea, Emily had felt a tightness in her chest. Going back to the theater, seeing a stage, watching other people dance. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. Michael noticed her hesitation and leaned forward slightly. "Please." She looked at him and saw a genuine sparkle in the boy's eyes. Michael didn't just want her to go, he needed her to go. Somehow he saw that moment as something special for the two of them. Emily sighed. "All right." The smile that Michael gave in response made her heart ache. Hours later, Emily sat in the theater's audience, feeling the weight of the environment around her. The place was majestic, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the golden ceiling, rows and rows of red seats filled with an eager crowd, and the stage. The stage glowed under the soft lights, waiting to come alive. She knew this space. Not this theater specifically, but the world, the wait before a performance, the tension in the air, the muffled sound of dancers backstage warming up, breathing deeply, preparing for a moment that could change everything. Michael, sitting beside her, watched it all with wide eyes, his excitement palpable. He didn't notice when Emily held her breath as she heard the first notes of the music. The show began. The dancers entered the stage with an ethereal lightness, gliding through the set as though defying gravity. The play of light and shadow accentuated every movement, every precise turn, every jump that seemed to suspend time. Emily didn't blink. With each scene, with each change in choreography, something inside her stirred. It was as if every step echoed inside her chest, pulling her back to the past. She remembered what it felt like to be there, the warmth of the lights on her shoulders, the texture of the floor beneath her feet, that exact moment before the music began, when the whole world seemed to hold its breath with her. And then, Arturo's memory flooded her mind. His smile before the performance, the way he teased her nerves, telling her that after that performance, they would be immortal. The sensation of dancing alongside him, the two of them in perfect sync, as if they had been born for this. The tightness in Emily's chest grew. For a moment she thought she wouldn't be able to bear it, that the theater was swallowing her, bringing everything she had tried to bury for so long back to the surface. But then she looked at Michael. He was completely absorbed, his eyes fixed on the stage, breathing with the music, feeling every note, every emotion transmitted by the dancers. It was then that she realized Michael was experiencing something she knew all too well. He was falling in love with it, and perhaps, just perhaps, she hadn't lost that love after all. After the performance, Michael was buzzing with excitement, talking non-stop about the show as they walked through the theater corridors. Emily listened to him, still processing everything she had felt, still trying to understand what that night meant to her. That's when, turning a corner, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "I can't believe it. Emily Garcia?" She stopped immediately. Slowly, she turned around and saw a tall man with neatly combed gray hair, dressed in an immaculate blazer. He was looking at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. She recognized that look. "Maestro Charles?" Her voice came out quieter than she meant. The man smiled warmly. "My God, it's been so long. You disappeared." Michael looked from Emily to the man, sensing that something important was happening. Emily felt her palms grow sweaty. She hadn't seen Charles in years, not since she had left the dance world. He had been one of her first teachers, one of the people responsible for her rise in ballet. And here he was, looking at her as if he couldn't believe he had actually found her. "I thought I'd never see you in a theater again." Emily tried to smile, but there was something uncomfortable about that realization. I just came to watch Michael." Charles looked at the boy next to her and nodded. "So he dances?" Michael stepped forward. "Yes, and Emily taught me." The teacher raised an eyebrow. "You're teaching?" Emily hesitated. "Just Michael." Charles observed her for a moment before crossing his arms. "You know, I'm opening a new ballet course for young talents. I need an assistant for the program. You should consider it." She was left speechless. Michael's eyes widened. "That would be amazing, Emily." But she didn't respond immediately. She felt a knot in her throat. "I don't think I'm the right person for that. It's been many years." Charles smiled, as though he had expected that answer. "Your talent hasn't disappeared. You just need to decide if you want to return." Emily looked away, still feeling a weight in her chest. Michael, standing beside her, clenched his fist with determination. "But I think you are." Emily looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. Charles smiled. "Think about it." He said his goodbyes and left, leaving Emily and Michael there, in silence. Later that night, back at home, Emily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Charles's invitation echoed in her mind. She wanted to say no. She wanted to insist that her life had moved on, that the stage no longer belonged to her. But something inside her wouldn't let her forget the sensation of being in the theater again. Dance was calling her back. The question was, would she be ready to listen? Emily spent sleepless nights, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to organize her thoughts. Since Charles's invitation, her mind had found no peace. Accepting that position meant more than just a job. It meant reopening a door she had locked away years ago, a door that led to a past that still hurt, but at the same time pulsed inside her like a memory impossible to erase. She tried to ignore the feeling. She tried to convince herself that her life had already been settled, that her time had passed. But every time she saw Michael dancing, every time she felt the polished wood smell of the theater, or heard music that transported her back to the stage, she knew there was something deep inside her that wasn't finished. The next morning, before she could talk herself out of it, she headed to Thomas's office. He was sitting at the desk, reviewing some papers when she entered. He didn't look up right away, but he noticed her presence. "I'm going to accept the position," she said firmly, without hesitation. Thomas raised his gaze, studying her for a moment. Then he simply nodded, as if he already knew that would be her decision. "It's the right thing to do." Emily wasn't sure if he said that as support or just as a pragmatic observation, but somehow she felt relieved that she didn't have to justify her choice. She turned to leave, but before she could take the first step, Thomas spoke again. "And Michael?" Emily stopped and looked at him. "He'll keep training, but he can't rely on me alone." Thomas leaned forward slightly, interlocking his fingers on the desk. "I've thought about that," he said. "If he wants to pursue this path, he needs the best." Emily frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I've found a professional trainer for him." Surprise overtook Emily's face. Thomas, who had always seemed so distant from the world of dance, was now investing in Michael's future. "And Michael knows about this." "Not yet, but he'll know this afternoon." Emily took a deep breath. She didn't know if she was more surprised by Thomas's decision or worried about Michael's reaction. When Thomas told Michael about the new trainer, the boy stood in silence for a long moment. "A professional trainer?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "If you want to continue on this path, you need to be trained by the best." Michael looked at Emily, almost as if seeking confirmation. She simply gave him a small smile. "It will be a challenge," she said, "but you're ready for it." He nodded. Even though part of him felt nervous, another part was excited. This was proof that his father was taking this seriously. But he had no idea what was coming. Training with a professional was a shock. The pace was completely different. There were no long breaks, no room for mistakes. The new trainer, Samuel Clark, was a tall, slender man with a critical gaze and always impeccable posture. He demanded more than Michael had ever experienced. Again, Michael felt sweat dripping down his temples, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. He had repeated that sequence what seemed like 100 times, but he didn't complain. He didn't give up. He wanted to be there. He wanted to get better. Emily watched the training whenever she could and saw the effort in the boy grow with each passing day. And she saw something else too, the way Thomas watched the training. At first, he stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, his critical, distant gaze. But as the days passed, he started to move closer. He started asking questions. What does he need to improve? How does this technique work? How long does it take to perfect a move like this? And with every answer he received, Thomas seemed less like an observer and more like someone who wanted to understand this world. Emily saw the change in him, and at the same time, she felt the change within herself. Returning to the dance studio as an assistant teacher felt like opening an old drawer and finding a part of herself that she thought she had lost. The smell of polished wood, the sound of ballet shoes tapping the floor, the echo of the music filling the space, resonating within her. In the first few days, she felt almost childishly nervous. The fear of making mistakes, of not remembering, of realizing that this world no longer belonged to her. But as the days passed, everything returned. The commands came out naturally, the directions were precise, the sharp eye for correcting wrong moves, the sensitivity to know when a student needed an extra push. It was as if dance had never left her. It had only been dormant. And then, one evening when the studio was empty, she found herself alone in front of the mirror. The silence was absolute. Emily moved closer slowly, her feet gliding across the wooden floor. She looked at her reflection and for a moment saw the young woman she used to be. Without thinking much, she closed her eyes and began to dance. The movements came naturally, as if her body had been waiting for that moment. A turn, a jump, a fluid sequence that shaped a story in the space she alone knew. And it was then that she realized she wasn't alone. When she opened her eyes, she saw Thomas standing in the doorway. He didn't say a word. He just watched her, his eyes fixed on her, an unreadable expression on his face. For a moment, Emily froze, but then she took a deep breath and completed the final step of the sequence. The silence remained between them, and for the first time, Thomas understood something he had never understood before. Dance wasn't just part of Emily's past, it was also her future. The theater was packed. The lights cast a golden aura over the stage, while voices murmured eagerly in the rows of seats. The atmosphere pulsed with energy, with the anticipation of the audience, the judges and the competitors, who waited for their moment to step into the spotlight. Backstage, Michael Walker stretched his arms and took a deep breath. He was here again. A year later, facing the same challenge, but this time, something inside him was different. His body was stronger, more resilient. His heart beat in sync with the rhythm, no longer out of step with fear. His mind, once filled with doubt, was now steady. He didn't see himself as just a boy trying to prove something anymore. Now, he belonged here. Daniel Scott, the two-time champion of the tournament, was nearby, warming up. Last year, Daniel's look toward Michael had been full of superiority and condescension, but this time, it was different. Daniel assessed him in a different way, with respect. There was no exchange of words, just a brief nod between the two. But that was enough. The names began to be called. One by one, the competitors took to the stage, danced their best, and left, breathless, waiting for the final announcement. Then, Michael heard his name. It was his turn. The theater went silent as the music began. Michael didn't need to think. His body knew what to do. Every step, every turn, every jump was an extension of what he felt. Dance wasn't just technique, it was emotion, it was truth. He wasn't there to beat Daniel Scott or impress the judges. He was there because he loved it, and that showed. The audience watched, eyes wide, holding their breath with each movement. Thomas, sitting in the audience next to Emily, kept his arms crossed, but his expression didn't hide the fascination he felt. He had never understood dance before, but now he saw what it meant. Michael was free when he danced. And then, the most critical moment of the choreography arrived. The jump. Michael gathered his strength and propelled himself into the air. Time seemed to slow for an instant. His muscles were in perfect control, and when his feet landed again, he felt it. Perfect. The silence lasted a second, and then applause erupted. At first, a restrained wave. Then it grew, exploding through the theater. He had given his best. Now, all that was left was to wait. The competitors lined up on stage side by side. The master of ceremonies stepped forward, holding the envelope with the results. The theater was so silent, you could hear the audience's held breath. And the winner of this year's tournament is... Michael's chest tightened. Michael Walker. He blinked a few times as if his brain needed time to process the information. He won. The theater erupted in applause once again. Daniel Scott turned to him and this time offered a sincere salute. "It was well deserved," he said. Michael accepted the handshake. He then scanned the faces that mattered most and found them. Emily was standing, clapping her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. She knew how much Michael had fought for that moment. She understood the weight it had for him. But it was Thomas who surprised him the most. His father was standing too. And for the first time, Michael saw a genuine smile on his face. The days that followed the tournament were different. Michael was no longer a beginner. He had become a true dancer, and with that, his dedication only grew. But the biggest transformation wasn't just in him. Emily had also found a new path. After so many years of avoiding dance, she was now fully immersed in it again. As a full-time teacher, she began to train new talents, forming new dancers, passing on to others what had once been taught to her, and over time, her relationship with dance changed. Before, it had been a wound, something that reminded her of what she lost. Now, it was her strength. Emily didn't just teach dance. She helped build dreams, and for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. Thomas watched it all with attentive eyes. He had always believed that success was about control, about impeccable planning, about making the right decisions to ensure the expected result. But now, sitting in his office, watching Michael train with a focus that only grew, and seeing Emily bloom in what she did, he started to understand something he had never seen before. Sometimes, success wasn't about control. It was about allowing those we love to find their own way. And more than that, it was about supporting them on that journey. He picked up his glass of whiskey and turned toward the window, looking out at the city lights. Michael had found his way. Emily had too. And perhaps for the first time, Thomas was beginning to understand what truly mattered.